Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to the Buddhist Wisdom Podcast. As you probably can see here today, I have Sharon Salzberg with me to chat about her new book, Real Life. So welcome, Sharon. Yeah. Super happy to have you.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too. For those of you who, well, I don't know, I don't want to assume anything, but I'm guessing most of our listeners know of you, Sharon, but just in case, I thought to offer a short introduction. So Sharon Salzberg is a meditation teacher, best-selling author, and co-founder of Insight Meditation Center in Barre, Massachusetts, with Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield. She's the author of 12 books, correct? Not 11, but 12 now.
12.
Okay. 12 books, including Loving Kindness, Real Happiness, Real Love, Real Change, and now the book we're going to discuss today, which is called Real Life, The Journey from Isolation to Openness and Freedom. What a cool title. And so, yeah, again, welcome, Sharon, and just super happy to chat with you about your book and, just to, get to hear from you a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I have some questions for you. We can also banter if that's more fun. But first of all, just this book, Real Life, I have some things, I've been reading it, and it's a wonderful book. And just first off, if you don't mind, I'll say a quick thought about it. And then I mostly want to hear from you about it, obviously, because you're the author. But, as I'm kind of gathering my thoughts for our conversation on this book, the more I read it, the more it feels like a letter to a friend. The more it feels like almost like a guidance manual. Like if you're just like, here, a friend asks you, hey, Sharon, what do you think about this? You're like, okay, here, Sharon, I need some help with this. You're like, here, and so I had a hard time actually coming up with a cohesive idea of what I wanted to talk to you about, because there's so much. There's so much in the book. Yeah.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's the first book I think I've written, or certainly in a very long time, with not traveling at all, because I was just here in Barre and kind of locked down like so many people were. And it made for a different kind of experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, congratulations on the book, by the way. It's a wonderful book. I forgot to say that. So yeah, just with that in mind, I mean, I'm sure everyone is coming to you with different takes on how the book is affecting them. Just wanted to share that briefly, because I'm also choosing some things from the book to maybe ask you about, and I just want the readers to know who or the listeners to know who haven't read the book yet. There's so much more. There's just a lot in this book. So I guess the first thing I wanted to hear from you is what made, like, how did you come to write this book? Because you're the author of 11 books. Like, why write a 12th book? Like, how'd that come about?
This is going to be like a confessional, is because the publisher asked me to.
Okay.
I was here in Barre, Mass. I also had an apartment in New York City. I spent February of 2020 traveling around California and teaching. I got back to New York in early March, and, people were starting to get really pretty sick, and there's a lot of anxiety, tremendous anxiety and uncertainty. And I had the thought at one point, maybe I'll go up to Barre for 2 weeks and ride it out till it's over. So I came up here in mid-March with my snow boots, and the retreat center was still open at the time. And within like 5 days, it had to close, and everything changed. And I was doing an enormous amount of teaching online. I just felt so badly for people who were struggling so much. And in the course of that, this publisher actually wrote and said, would you like to write another book? Maybe something else in the Real series. And I thought about it very deeply, and whether I wanted to or not, and both the contact I was having with people and just feeling so much for them and what people were going through, and the fact that I was in lockdown, like I was in isolation, and the fact that I saw this show on YouTube called Saturday Night Seder, celebrating the Passover, and it reminded me that symbolically, taking it totally away from geopolitics, symbolically, that is a journey of all people at all times toward freedom. And the word Egypt actually means narrow place or narrow straits. So it's a journey from feeling trapped and no options and I can't breathe, and to a state of openness and freedom. And I thought, there's a book. There's an arc of a book. And so I got to write it.
Wonderful. So your kind of I guess structure to it is basically that journey from narrowness to. I mean, there's a few different ways you talk about it. Talk about that in the book. You use the word openness, but also you use constriction. To openness. Correct? Yeah.
Well, yeah. But I mean, I didn't want to imply that narrowness was the same as being determined or one-pointed or intentional, because I don't think it is. It really is a sense of being trapped. Yeah.
And ultimately, I mean, as I'm reading the book, I as a Buddhist practitioner, and generally we like to talk about Buddhism on this podcast somewhat, mostly how that relates to our individual lives and others. But it is a Dharma book, this book, and that's my take on it as I'm reading it. And within that, that sense of you go through quite a bit of description of how the traditional Buddhist path describes narrowness and versus. Sorry, I was misspoken. It's not constriction versus openness. It's constriction versus expansion, right? Yeah. So I think for you, how does that weave in? Because I mean, for some of the listeners, I think most of my listeners know you in some capacity, but for those who don't, I mean, your background is so vast in Buddha Dharma in the West. I mean, so I'd love to hear anything you have to say around that connection into the book. Also, actually, I'll save my second question. Yeah, for later.
Okay. So, as I say in the introduction, if I think about that journey from constriction to expansion or isolation to openness and freedom, of course, the pattern or the languaging I'm most familiar with is from the Buddhist teaching. And so I try to look at, when do we tend to feel the most constricted? It's when we're the most overwhelmed, we feel the most trapped. We can't breathe. It's a lot of pain often. And that's greed, hatred, and delusion from within that framework. And it's been clear to me for many years that it's not just the arising of those states, but it's the way we hold them. As Sonny Rinpoche would say, it's not the thought that's the problem, it's the glue. Yeah. So when we're overcome by one of those states, that's when there's really a tremendous amount of suffering. And I also try to look at those states in sort of with a contemporary lens, like instead of just saying greed, I began to investigate addiction and addictive patterns. And instead of just saying hatred, I was really fascinated by the idea of shame, because within the Buddhist psychology, there are different ways of distinguishing it, but there are useful states of remorse or regret, even though painful, they're very useful. And then there are other states that are not that useful. They're really like a trap. And we might call that guilt. We might call that shame. Certainly in the Western psychological construct, it would be shame. It's not just saying like I blew it when I said that thing or didn't say anything at all in that meeting, and lessons learned, that's a really painful memory. I have to try to go on and try to be different. Instead of that, it's like, I am so terrible. I am so horrible. Yeah. I can never change, which is useless. It's painful. It's exhausting. It's demoralizing, and it's not onward leading in any way. It's a form of hatred. Yeah. So that was really interesting to me, to try to explore different nuances and dimensions of these states. And then a very crucial part was, what do you do about them? If you just get more ashamed and more afraid, and you heap all that on your head, it's not going to do anything. And so, rather than trying to annihilate them and have that sort of embattled mentality, can we create almost like a different holding environment so that our relationship to them shifts? And interestingly enough, in being interviewed about the book, the one practice that everyone, and certainly most of them have not been practitioners themselves, everyone picks up on his handshake, which also comes from Sonny Rinpoche.
Yeah.
It just seems very striking as a way of, oh, that's different. It's a different way of relating to something that's been causing me a lot of problems. And, practicing however we express it, that different relationship gets us moving. And then there are fascinating things about a journey. What do we want to take with us? What do we might want to leave behind? And then the other part of it is really cultivating what we are capable of, which is gratitude and generosity and loving kindness and so on, and feeling the relief and the expansiveness of those states.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. So much there. Yeah. For the listeners, I mean, Sharon, I don't remember did we meet at one of Rinpoche's retreats? Was that the first
Probably.
time?
Probably.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's okay to out you, but Sharon is a longtime friend of Sonny Rinpoche, and those of you probably know, listen to this regularly. Sonny Rinpoche is one of my main teachers. So, when I saw the handshake practice in there, I got excited, and also really happy for people. Handshake practice, as Rinpoche teaches it, has been probably one of the most transformative practices for me personally. I think before it is like that. You describe the sense of people reading and be like, oh, I never thought of it that way. When I first came to it, and probably from being around Sonny Rinpoche for many years, he also embodies a sense of the handshake practice and just how he is. And that gets transmitted. And I think the first retreat I went to, it was almost this it was a mix of awe and like, as if I hit my head against the wall, because it was just this this huge blind spot for me for many years. So that's wonderful to hear. Maybe we could talk about that a little bit. I'd love to hear from you first, specifically, what you think that piece of the handshake practice that's unique for people, and especially in relation to what we're talking about, shame, hatred, greed, etc. Yeah.
Well, it's been interesting for me, seeing that, because there are, I think, several ways one could express that same attitudinal shift, and that seems to be the one that is most captivating for people, which is interesting. Like within kind of Burmese tradition, the popular way of saying that was actually popularized by Tara Brach, one of the teachers, called RAIN, RAIN. So it's recognizing what's happening, acknowledging it or accepting it, rather than fighting it and hating yourself for it. Investigating it so that if there's enough space around what's going on, we have a chance to see more deeply into it. Not like, why is it here and what am I going to do about it? But what is this? Yeah. What is this made of? And, if we're looking at anger, for example, we may see sadness within it. We may see fear within it. We will likely see a sense of helplessness within it. We'll see change within it. Mm. It's actually an alive system. We think these things are so inert and unmoving, unchanging. But when we actually can look, instead of fighting it and being freaked out about it, it's like, oh, look at that.
Yeah.
It's moving, it's changing. And so that's the investigate. And then the N has changed in time, the N in RAIN. It started out with non-identifying, rather than, say, grabbing onto that anger and declaring, I'm such an angry person and I always will be. These days, Tara in particular uses N for nurturing. Like, be kind to yourself anyway.
Yeah.
Even though you've got this really intense and kind of difficult and complicated thing going on, you can still be kind to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And the handshake, for me, the unique aspect of it is the fourth aspect of not trying to fix, manipulate, change anything, which I think is a quite radical because I guess we could say there's nurturing in that, but I don't know if you sense any kind of distinct thing, and maybe that relates to people being like, oh, I didn't, that's like a new thing for people.
Well, I mean, I think that's inherent, and maybe it's implicit in the acknowledge part in the A.
Got it.
That's what we're doing. We're not trying to strategize our way out of it. We're not blaming ourselves for it. We're not declaring, I'm done with that and it's never going to appear again, or whatever. It's like, okay, this is what's happening right now.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of similarities, but there's something I think quite captivating in the way Rinpoche describes it.
Yeah. Do you want to describe it for listeners who don't know of it, or would you like me to? Or?
Oh, I think I would like you to.
Uh-oh. Okay, very briefly, because I have a lot of content on this. People can go check it out elsewhere. But basically, the handshake practice Sharon and I are discussing, which Sharon mentions in her book, is, as Sharon already said, it is kind of an invention of Sodni Rinpoche, though he admits that he had the help of some friends who were psychotherapists and modern psychology. And he basically blended some elements of Mahamudra meditation coming from the Tibetan lineages into, with somatic psychology, with some other psychotherapy methods. And it's basically a mindfulness of feeling practice, a mindfulness of body practice, dropping into the body and attempting or practicing letting be with whatever's arising. And what's not letting be is suppressing what's arising, becoming or indulging in it. Running away, or what Sharon and I were just discussing, trying to fix, change, manipulate. So, I was recently doing a Q&A for the Fully Being community of Sodni Rinpoche's course, and I was reviewing some of Rinpoche's teachings, and the one that stuck out about handshake the most for me was handshake is more about what you're not doing than what you're doing. So yeah, I would love anything to add, Sharon, please. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much in that. There's like layers and layers and layers, because it implies you're forgiving yourself for what you're feeling. You're not carrying on a pattern of maybe really harsh self-judgment, which leads nowhere. Again, it's not to be complacent about things, but it's to be wise about things, like what's actually going to work to disentangle this kind of grabbing onto these states and having them be so constricting. And, that implies that kind of forgiveness, that self-compassion, that balance. There's a real balance in being aware of what's happening without freaking out about it. Perspective. I mean, there's so many things that are in there, and it's a really fun way of describing it.
Yeah. What I find, I'm not sure with students you interact with on the handshaking practice or any embodiment practice for that matter is, it's just so hard for us in the modern world to be with our sensations and emotions. It's just very hard because they, immediately we want to get rid of them, including we want to use meditation to get rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. So we can move on a little bit. I have a question, but I kind of put it down, but maybe I'll ask it now because it kind of came up already. You mentioned it, but I'll bring it back into the conversation. In the first few chapters, especially, I believe the first chapter or second chapter, you describe this instance of the Seder, and you use the Seder as the Jewish Seder as an analogy for that narrowness versus expansion. And I was just really curious on a personal level, as much as you feel comfortable sharing. We also share, Jewish roots in common. That's my birth. For me, it's an ethnicity. Actually, it's not so much my spiritual path, but it's an ethnicity. But it does seem that for me, what I got through the book is you do have a very strong connection to the spiritual practices of Judaism. And yet, of course, you've been not only going deep in your own Buddhist practice for 30, 40 plus years, but you share that with others. So I was just kind of curious on that convergence for you. I was really, curious for you on a personal level, how those two things converge.
Yeah, not so much actually. I mean, I grew up in part with my grandparents who were quite observant, and so there was a period of my life where I was, not turning on the lights on Saturday or something like that. And,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't say it was a very meaningful set of rituals for me. I think really the Seder stood out in all of that as a gathering of family. And my family was very broken, broken apart and in lots of different ways. And so it just had that kind of special resonance. And in later years, when I've led Seders and things like that, I tend to use the Jewish Buddhist Haggadah, it's the text, which will interpose, Padmasambhava with Moses or something like that. Because that is really the spiritual language that I understand like bone deep, or I adhere to, in the deepest way. And so it's really more for that kind of family sense. So maybe it's not that different from you, after all.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. So the meaning for you is in that community, is in that gathering, more than anything else. Yeah, that makes for me. It's the food. it's always been the food, which is the gathering.
There's the
food. Right? Awesome. So, one thing I've always been in awe of you as a Dharma teacher, and part of it's something that I see in your teaching work. I mean, there's many things that you do well, and the way you benefit others is for me quite amazing. But specifically in the way you tell stories, and it's something I think it's like a quality I want to develop. So obviously, sometimes we see in others what we want to develop, but this question started to develop for me around the role of stories in your teaching work, and the role of stories in the book, because the book, I would say, it's like 70% stories almost, or it's half stories. So yeah, any thoughts on that? I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, and I think interestingly enough, that's what people tend to remember. And even if they remember the story wrong, they remember the point right. Yeah. I've had that experience too, and say, when you told about the time, I think, really? But they got the point of the story in some other form. That's how we learn, maybe. That's a very meaningful way of communicating. And for me, it started, I started teaching with Joseph Goldstein in 1974. He was at Naropa Institute. It was the first summer that it was opened, and a bunch of us, I had just come back from India and went to visit him. And Jack Kornfield was living down the hall, and Joseph's course was so popular, he was asked to stay on for the second session, and I stayed on with him. And then we got invited to teach a month-long retreat. So that was the first retreat that we taught in this country. And I was absolutely petrified of public speaking. It's like I could not bring myself to give a talk. And I could speak to people. I could do Q&A maybe, or talk to them about their meditation. But my fear was that I was going to be giving a more formal lecture. My mind would go blank. I wouldn't know what to say next. I'd be sitting there, like that. So this is a 30-day course. Joseph had to, the way we do retreats, intensive retreats, is we may be meeting with people during the day, people are practicing, and then there's one formal talk at night only. And I couldn't do it. So Joseph had to give 30 talks.
Wow.
And all these people were coming up and yelling at him, like, why won't you let her speak? Why won't you let her have a voice? And he was like, I talk to her, like, I just couldn't do it. I was so scared. Yeah. And a long time went by, and then I had the thought, there is that practice called loving kindness, which I had learned about but hadn't really done intensively. And there's a guided meditation that goes along with it. So maybe if that happens, my mind goes blank. And that was the topic. It was loving kindness. I could launch into the guided meditation and no one would know. So it was the only thing I could talk about for a very long time was loving kindness.
Yeah.
And then one day I thought, it's really all about loving kindness. It doesn't have to be, no one's here to, get excited about my expertise about anything, Yeah. It's like a connection. And so that we're all on this path, and we can encourage one another. And that's really what it's about. And somewhere in there, somebody said to me, you don't have to sound like Joseph. You don't have to sound like anyone else. Very logical, philosophical. He said, sound like you. He said, like the monks and this other sort of branch, the Thai forest tradition. He said, they just tell stories. That's how they teach. And I thought, that might be a thing I can do, and so it just kind of came that way.
Yeah, wow. What was that something that you had to practice doing, or did that come a little bit more natural? Or was it similar to kind of public speaking?
I think it just came, but because it's easier.
Yeah.
But I love I've told stories, for example, for the Moth, this organization, which is like a storytelling organization, and they train you how to do it better, which and that's why I did it. I wanted the training. I thought, this is very great.
That's so cool. So there's if it's okay to quote some parts of the book, if that's okay with you, specifically, this comes a little later in the book on connection. I forget the name of the chapter, but I think it's close to the end. And I'll just read this, and then we can go ahead. So we live, quote, we live in a more atomized society. An outside emphasis on individualism is often coupled with a worldview of scarcity. Pervasive need to accumulate as much as I can for me and mine. So, this really, for me, summed up a large part of our kind of modern predicament, and I was curious. I mean, you definitely provide some outlets for solutions or practices or methods to work with, but I just kind of wanted to hear more from you, how you see this playing out in those around you and students you interact with, and in particular, because this is a kind of a Buddhist meditation podcast or a meditation podcast, how you see that playing out in meditators. Like, how does that play out? What do you notice?
Well, as I'm sure you know, like the Surgeon General of the United States is talking and writing a lot about loneliness and how it's like an epidemic, and it has, according to him, very severe health consequences, and even before the pandemic, I would read about epidemics of loneliness, and I would read about how a sense of social connection can be a healing agent, a strong healing agent in different clinical conditions. And I kept thinking, well, it can't just be a numbers game, like I only have 2 friends, I need at least 7, Yeah. It must be some inner sense, because I certainly know, and I'm sure you do, and maybe most people do, someone who is not like a social butterfly, but has such a powerful sense of connection and caring, toward others. And so I really felt it must be like an inner sense of belonging, being able to find yourself in others and having sometimes a strong understanding of interconnection and so on, and being part of a whole in a way. And everything I've seen, during the pandemic really reinforced that. I mean, there was so much isolation, and it was so toxic for so many people. And I used to read those chats all the time because I was teaching practically nonstop and periods of it. And it was just dreadful. And, to understand that most people don't have necessarily that kind of inner sense, and the ordinary ways, the casual ways we used to hang out together are not maybe so prevalent. Like in an earlier book, I talked about this book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, which was about the dissolution of bowling leagues around the United States. And so, you used to, I don't know, Wednesday or night or something like that, you used to go bowling with your friends, and that sort of stopped. And the adherence to organized religion and a sense of finding a community there was not there for many people. And, so that's been harmful. And even certainly the advent of phones, and people, because I grew up in New York City, people would often say to me things like, I remember in New York, you could strike up the oddest and most interesting conversations with somebody, like sitting next to you in a bus. And he said, now no one talks to one another. Everyone's on their phone.
Yeah.
And so you can see how society is kind of almost conspired. It's restructured to have us be more and more alone. And so it takes a lot of effort, but the effort needs to come from that inner space, that we really are connected to one another. So what happens when I look at the world in that way? And certainly I've seen it. Sometimes I look back at, because I forget that it's been so many years of this sort of odd sort of isolation that was so prevalent. Again, not for everybody, but for many. And, somebody said to me something about like, when did you last see so-and-so? And I said, a while ago. And they said, well, it's got to have been more than 3 years ago, right? And I think, oh, right. It's like, wow, that went fast in a way, or what a strange thing. It's been 4 years since I've seen some friends. And, fortunately, I do feel very close to people via, social media or Zoom or something like that. I genuinely do. So, but not everyone's like that.
Yeah, me too. I'm like that because I'm seeing people, mentees or whatever throughout the week. And for me, there was a lot of warmth there in the pandemic when it was harder to socialize in person. Yeah, I'd love to stay here because I think there's so much in the book. You mentioned that during the pandemic, I think I remember seeing this on social media. Like I think I remember. Was this public? Like where you started a 1-800 line that people could call and you got volunteers. Was that only private?
No, it wasn't me. It was somebody that I interviewed in the book because I have a podcast also, and so I was able for the book to look back at some of those conversations and include parts of them. So that somebody did start that, and I thought it was the most beautiful idea. Her name was Kathy, and it was basically you could call and ask someone to sing you a song, or or let's just sit together and meditate, or could you read me, from this text, or this novel, or something like that, or let's have a conversation. I haven't talked to anybody lately, and it was so beautiful.
Yeah, that's really. Sorry, I thought it was you, but maybe you posted it at some point, or maybe it was just on your podcast. Maybe
it was definitely on my podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's where I saw it because I vaguely remember that. But that was really beautiful, and you touched on it. I pulled another quote here, very short, but you touched on it, and I'd love to probe more here. Where you said, "Connection is our greatest source of expansiveness. Ultimately, connection is an inner state." And you mentioned that of this difference between cultivating 7 friends versus 2, and it actually. So I'd love to hear just more about that. I mean, as practitioners, we both know about cultivating that inner state, but I don't know. I don't know if that's always so explicit, meaning like meditation is such a solitary act, but it's not at its root. It's just, it seems that way initially,
Yeah, I think that's so funny, really, because it could be, you might be sitting all alone. You might be sitting with your eyes closed. It seems like it would be the most withdrawn kind of activity ever. Yeah. But it genuinely is not, because of the insight that develops is, what is. And that's one of the funny things about interconnection. It's like, people might approach it as a concept or a kind of superimposition that we're laying this on reality, but it is reality, and, it doesn't take a spiritual understanding to discern that. Like science shows us that, economics shows us that, certainly environmental consciousness shows us that, and even epidemiology shows us that, which is something I have been saying in a prescient kind of way for a number of years. And so, what happens over there doesn't nicely stay over there ever. And it's long been my favorite question going into a company or an organization to teach. It's like, how many other people need to be doing their job well for you to do your job well? And, that was enhanced during the pandemic when I was talking to this physician who has a large medical practice he supervises in a hospital. And he said, who I have an increased appreciation for? He said, the cleaning staff. I thought, well, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, I ask that question, and mostly people ponder and they go, "Oh, that's interesting." And occasionally it doesn't strike a chord. And so I go on to say, "Well, do you commute to work? Do you ever think of the train engineer or the auto mechanic? Or if you don't commute, certainly there's probably technology involved. Do you think of those people?" And that didn't go anywhere once either. So I said, "Have you eaten today? And what if you didn't grow all your own food?" Like, it takes a lot for that carrot to end up on your plate. Really, let's think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thousands, if not millions of sentient beings involved.
Yeah.
I mean, because of all the bugs and et cetera, unseen beings. Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. One thing I was reflecting on as you were talking is personally, on a personal level, I don't always notice something that was so vital to the interdependence of a certain function in my life until it's gone. And sometimes I think we're in an interesting place because you were naming this, you were naming part of the social factors of modern life and disconnect and over reliance on technology and all that. And when I was a monk, I was pretty right up until the end. I was pretty how do you say it? Committed to wearing my robes in most places. And one thing that was interesting was it was like a big banner for it's like an advertisement banner for Buddhism. So obviously I had to be careful with, how I acted. If I was in a bad mood, I couldn't necessarily express that always because I was representing something. But at the same time, more than not, it was a very useful tool of connection because people would see the monk's robes, kind of be curious and open up a conversation or a question or something. And I considered that a part of kind of not even a service as a monastic, but just, a service as a human of like being available. How do you say, like a sense of generosity that we, not always being in a rush everywhere and having time to talk with someone. And, now it's very different for me. I have a daughter and, I keep pretty busy with my teaching work and stuff. And I've noticed how that's impacted me, that difference, that sense of not, I have other ways I offer generosity of time, but that has gone away a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's a depersonalization in a good way or something.
Yeah, I have this friend who does who does VR and meditation work, and it's really interesting. He's seeing some, where technology can often be this, thing that moves us apart. He's saying the opposite. So he's saying, if you design it in a certain way, it can also come, bring us back to what serves us the most.
Oh yeah. Well, I was so grateful. Like when Sunny Rinpoche started teaching online,
yeah. I think, the pandemic produced a lot of not so good things, but some really good things. I mean, some of the teachings I received in the Tibetan lineages via Zoom would have not, like, those teachers would have never, ever, ever come on Zoom. For in the, probably as you're aware, in the Tibetan lineages, it's sort of like they question if certain things can be done virtually. So they were really reluctant, and some teachers, and so it really created. There's just a boom, right? Yeah. I had one more kind of specific thing, if you have any thoughts on it, around this issue of connection being both an inner and outer thing, and more just related to, back to what we were discussing a minute ago about meditators and sometimes the view that meditation is this solitary. I mean, just self-admittedly, I spent a pretty decent chunk of my time as a meditator in this life, or trying to be a meditator, isolated, meaning like, getting angry if somebody's interrupting my meditation or something like that, or miffed maybe is more of a better word, or slightly annoyed. And which is showing okay, there's something missing here. There's, so I think a lot of us struggle with that. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, specific to meditators.
Well, I mean, that's, classically probably the role of the teacher is to annoy us for one thing, and interrupt us and, taunt us when we do get impatient. Like, oh, you're impatient. You're sitting there, praying for the happiness of all beings. And then this person interrupts you and you hate them, that's the mirror they hold up in front of us and say, look at that,
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're very conditioned and it is definitely, a challenge because we tend to bring all of that conditioning right into the meditative process, or onto our path. And so there's all that self-judgment perhaps, or shame, or kind of clinging, like I'm going to get there fastest, or wherever there is. And including like my path is far better than anyone else's. Lots and lots of habits of mine that come right along with us. And do we tend to see them ourselves? I think with a sincere motivation in time, we will see them.
Yeah.
And a teacher certainly can hasten that process.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is from your perspective, it's it's just unavoidable because obviously we're going to bring whatever we're dealing with in our life to the meditation. Yeah. Have you seen kind of the role? Because you started, with Joseph and Jack, one of the first Western Dharma communities, maybe the first. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you have so much experience with community. So I don't know, just any more thoughts on that? Because I just see this as this is a very tricky part of the import of, Asian Buddhist lineages into the West. So just curious, any insight there?
Well, it is very nuanced and complex, but it's a balance. I think, because sometimes in the West, people feel that there should be no hierarchy in a community, or no specialization in the community, and that's kind of crazy making, because I've not just a community. I have an organization here which has a board of directors and a financial responsibility and keeping. I mean, we just had a sewer pipe blow, after almost 50 years. That was unpleasant,
I'm sure
someone has to take care of that,
Yeah.
So yeah, that was like outrageous. So we've kind of gone, different places with this, but I, just as I honor the fact that I have a teacher and, we're different teachers and, but there's some underlying self-respect that's also very, very important. And, I wrote a book years ago called Faith, and people were saying, why are you writing a book on that? Because for them, faith meant being silenced or not being able to ask questions. And so, that can't prevail either, and be like a vibrant and alive spiritual community. And so it's a powerful vessel for a lot of learning. And I think, I didn't realize, because in Asia, living in India, where I met, so many people like Joseph, we had an kind of inevitable community, and I think we all took it for granted. And it was back here after teaching for some time that I realized, wow, here's this person who's like getting up and going to work. They work in some environment where they're being asked to lie, that could be the case, or it's a little shifty, or their values are just not reflected there at all.
Yeah.
And then they come home, and, then when I began working with caregivers, I worked with a lot of domestic violence shelter workers, for example. That was the first primary group. And they were very alone because they felt, not because of confidentiality, but they felt they couldn't burden their family with the terrible stuff they were hearing and seeing. And so, and they weren't talking to each other either. Or you talk to doctors, of a certain era, they weren't talking to each other. And so people were like dealing with so much, trying to do well and do good and being so alone. And again, it was like a construct, of society. And it took me a long time to realize that these people are really alone, like unlike myself who had, Joseph and Dan Goleman and people from my first breath, conscious breath, And so really it became an emphasis that where it had not been early in our teaching.
Do you think that was I'm trying to think of the right word, the situation you all ended up in, going to India, Asia, as kind of like early explorers in the, this was the early 60s or mid 60s or?
It was the early 70s. I went in 1970. Yeah.
Yeah. You think it was almost like y'all didn't have a choice? It was sort of like there were so few people doing that when you brought it back to the West or the States, you almost had to, like community was just inevitable. Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's when we came back, meditation was still kind of woo-woo and, seen as woo-woo and strange and esoteric, but we were teaching, and so people had a chance to have an experience of it, and there was no technology then; it didn't exist. And I remember somebody proposed to us once that we create a series of tapes. This is a long time ago, like videotapes that they would sell in health food stores. So that if somebody was going in for some vitamin C, they might see a how to meditate tape or something and buy it and be served by it. And we had actual big discussions like, is that ethical? Because the thing that would characterize my generation of people meditating is that we had big intentionality because you couldn't find it casually. You really had to want to learn it. And so like I had to go to India when I'd never even been to California, and so either you had significant suffering in your life or you were put together in some way you had just like intense curiosity about life and you just wanted to see more deeply. But whatever it was intense, because you had to really find it. And that was the ethical question. Like, what if someone's just going in for vitamin C? Is it okay that they end up with meditation instruction? They don't have that intention, that drive. And it never happened anyway. And then, of course, now it's laughable because,
That's why I'm laughing, yeah.
It's everywhere, like.
The ethics of a cassette tape in a health food store versus what's happening now. Yeah.
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 And I think it's great what's happening now in terms of access and why should you have to go to India? And the question of motivation or intention, of course, is there kind of implicit, but it shouldn't be, I think, because it's withheld, that people have to find that.
Yeah. Yeah. I see that as like a really key difference culturally for us, where it's sort of, everything's there and then it's up to us to grow the discernment of how to interact with something where, you had to ask a teacher a few times generally in Tibet before they'd give you something real serious, practice related. And they were checking to make, not because they were trying to hide something, they were trying to protect the student, generally. They were trying to make sure the student would be benefited from it, as opposed to just wasting the student's time. Where I think it's just a different ethic. Yeah, I agree with you. It's just there. And now we have to kind of have our discernment. That's a whole nother episode, maybe. Yeah,
that'd be fun.
I know you got to go, but I wanted to circle back to your book. And since we don't have too much time, is there anything you'd love to share around your book that we didn't cover, or anything that that's up for you right now, that you'd love to share with me or others?
I think, well, first of all, you should invite me back. That would be nice.
Yes, you're invited back.
We can talk about discernment and intention. It'd be very interesting.
Cool. I'm going to write that down.
Well, actually, this is, it starts with a discussion of this research, very pretty old research project where all these residents in a nursing home were given a plant, and half of them were told, well, you should pay attention to this plant, see when it needs water, when it needs sunlight or whatever, and you're responsible for the plant and its well-being. And the other half were told, just enjoy the plant. Nurses can take care of it. And then they compared those two groups in terms of longevity and health and orientation and all that, and they were quite different. And so then go on to describe, different kinds of plants, some of which can make it, they just survive, even if you're not paying much attention to it. But what they don't do is thrive if you're not paying much attention to it. So then I go on to describe this word tejas from Pali, which is the language of the original Buddhist text, which means heat or flame or fire or light, and also has a sense of splendor and radiance and glory. Tejas is brightness, a potent and alive energy, a strength and power of luminosity. As we uncover it, Tejas drives us toward life, openness, and renewal. This light exists nestled within us, innate to our beings, not because we're particularly unique or outstanding or did something special to deserve it, but simply because we exist. So then I go on to say, in a way, this journey from a narrow place to expansion and freedom lies outside of time and space. We can traverse that seemingly daunting distance with a thought. We can travel that length without accruing any mileage at all, with remembering right now what we really care about, or recollecting right now the source of our deepest happiness, or coming back right now to our essential selves. We can explore the terrain of awe or gratitude or self-respect or love. We needn't be fooled by the layers of fear and craving and shame and confusion covering over that light. We can remind ourselves the light is never more than partially covered. And while it may feel remote, it is accessible always. Because it is always accessible, we are here now. It's upon this seed of radiance that we turn toward the good. We nourish it, we cultivate it. It's not up to the nursing staff or our forebears or anybody else. As with the hardy plants I discussed earlier, the latent luminosity within can endure neglect, but it can also thrive when it receives care and attention. Left on its own, the light will survive. Half hidden, quiescent, nurtured, the light can blaze forth. That's like my favorite part of the book.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I remember reading that. Yeah. That's wonderful. That thank you for sharing that, first of all. And yeah, that really reminds me of Buddha nature in the Mahayana context, right? Yeah, it's this light that's there, but we need to water it too. Right, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful, Sharon. Sharon, thank you so much for being here, and please come back. Please come back. And,
yeah, thank you. Others too.
Yeah, great. So thank you for doing all your just amazing work. Just on a personal level, I want to thank you.
Well, thank you. Be well, and we'll continue this conversation.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, take care, Sharon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.